The Yew Tree by Shamus Frazer. When Martin was passing through Singapore last week en route to Australia, I took him to the Botanical Gardens. It is a practice of mine to show off the Botanical Gardens to visitors from England. They feel at home there. It is Kew all over again, without the glass. But in Martin's case, our visit was very far from being a success. At first, I put his queer behaviour down to fear of snakes. When we were skirting the top end of the lake, he kept to the centre of the narrow path, glancing uneasily at the great tongues of foliage that fringed the borders, and treading as delicately as Agag. Once he shied at a root that lay twisted like a snake across his path. "I've been here 100 times," I said, "and I've never seen a snake yet. It's as safe as Ireland." He pulled himself together and stepped over the roots, but I noticed his hands were shaking, and his face had the look of a cheap soapstone carving, a greenish pallor on which the features seemed tenuously and grotesquely scratched. "You know that great banyan tree by the wooden bridge at the farther end of the lake, a grotto of gnarled roots and python-thick columns formed by the fibres coiling down from the branches like Rapunzel's hair to root in the soil? Well, nothing could induce Martin to go past that tree. He stuck on the edge of the lake, looking ghastly. We had in the end to retrace our steps. If only I'd not thought of bringing him up by the terraced pergola, the evening might have ended less embarrassingly for us both. But at the same time, I should possibly have missed a very strange story. We were going up the steps under the arch of creepers when I heard a gasp from Martin. "Good God!" he cried. "Don't tell me there are yew trees in Malaya." He was looking at a tree on the terrace a few yards to our left, a tree which does, in fact, bear some resemblance to the yew. "I think that's a cintada," I said. "There's certainly a likeness." Then I noticed Martin's expression. He was staring in horror at that cintada tree, and he was positively tottering on the edge of the steps as if he were going to faint. I caught him by the arm, helped him down the last flight of steps, and steered him to the car. He was pale and dazed as a zombie, and I half feared he was suffering from heat stroke. By the time we reached home, he had recovered more or less, but his teeth clinked like ice against the rim of the tumbler as he drank off the double whisky I poured for him. "I'm sorry," he said at last. "I made an awful ass of myself just now. I ought never to have gone into the beastly place, but I didn't expect. You see, now it happened a good many years ago. I suppose I've not got over it yet. I wonder if I ever shall." "Don't tell me if it'll upset you again," I said with a revolting hypocrisy, for I am curious by nature, and nothing is more distasteful to me than unresolved mysteries. He was silent for a while, and I thought he was going to take me at my word. I poured him a stiffer drink. "They do say these things are sometimes better for a father confessor," I said. A sudden sigh of wind stirred a rustling from the trees in the garden, and Martin shivered and pulled his chair round with a creak to face the sound. "You won't believe the tale," he said. "Nobody does. Sometimes I try to kid myself it was a dream, but that's no use. It wasn't, you see." He hesitated again, then he asked, "Do you know Darkshire?" "I stayed near Doomchester once. It's a pretty place." "If you like trees," he said, without any particular expression, "there's the remains of Robin's Forest and those great feudal estates, the princedoms." "All sold up now," I said. "I used to spend holidays there when I was a child," said Martin. "I loved the place, trees too, but I didn't know the western side until a few years ago when I was sent up there on a job. Do you know that side at all?" "Vaguely, bleak and hilly, full of limestone caverns and lead workings and streams spilling over boulders." "It's an evil place," he said, and relapsed into silence. "But there are few trees, Martin," I said, keeping him to the point. Oh, the forest creeps up into those Pennine valleys. The hills are bare enough, but you get those beastly secretive valleys, like Harrowvale, for instance. Never been there. You can be thankful you won't have a chance. It lies under several million gallons of water now. I was sent up to report on the place. You know that group of great reservoirs there that feed Sheffield and several of the Yorkshire industrial towns? Well, they were planning an extension of the Tarnthorpe Reservoir, and Harrowvale seemed a likely place to meet requirements. For one thing, no one lived there. No one had lived there for well over 100 years, so I was sent off to make a preliminary survey. I put up first at Bridge, a pleasant pub there, but it was rather far from the valley, and as the work progressed I looked around for some place nearer at hand. There was a deserted farm cottage overlooking the western end of Harrowvale, and a firm had put it in order for me. My early reports had convinced them that the Harrowvale plan was feasible, and they decided I should stay and hunt around for snags, especially over the winter months. Snow and winter rains can upset the finest paper calculations as far as my survey work is concerned. Well, the cottage was snug enough, a honeymooner's dream, but lonely for a bachelor. A path led from it round the neighbouring hill, and so descended abruptly into Bridge on the other side. This was the path I liked to take, especially as the evenings were drawing in. There was another path which led into Harrowvale itself, through the wood, but I didn't care much for it. It was gloomy and dark, and about a quarter of a mile beyond the cottage you passed the skeletons of a church, and some derelict cottages, all that was left of the old village of Harrowvale. I wasn't, anyway, a very imaginative sort of person, but there was a kind of desolate knowingness about the place, and I avoided this path when I could. Blasting had begun in the eastern end of the valley, and an army of woodcutters were at work cutting down the fir and sycamore plantations under the stern eye of old Wyke, who had sold us the valley but kept a retainer on the timber. My work, now that winter was setting in, consisted of checking and revising my earlier calculations, and it involved a good deal of field work, wriggling down potholes, plumbing underground waterways, testing the altered direction of streams with fluorescein powder, and so on. Often I didn't get back till nightfall, and I found it sometimes convenient to take the path through the wood and past the old village of Harrowvale. I never enjoyed the walk now. The plantation stopped before you got to the village, but there was a lot of undergrowth among the ruins and things on the path, brambles, I suppose, that caught the ankles and made walking difficult. The ruined church tower made noises in the moonlight, owls, I imagined. Then about 100 yards on there was a kind of open place, beastly, a sort of crossroads with the roads vanished, if you see what I mean, and the path sloping up very steeply to my own cottage, below the brow of the ridge. It was this open place I loathed in the daylight, and could hardly bring myself to pass at night. You see, there was growing there a yew tree. That soapstone look again, I pushed him over another drink. A yew tree, he repeated, largest, black as a hearse plume, and in winter dotted all over with blood drops of berry. Perhaps it had been clipped by a topiarist a century or more ago, but whatever shape it had once was lost. It had the suggestion of some kind of bird. No, yes, an owl or a bat, some flying nocturnal thing with ragged wings and a shapeless, swollen body. I thought it might have marked the limit of an old graveyard, but it would have to have been a very spacious graveyard, and would have needed to fill it more dead than even the hamlet of Harrowvale could have provided in 1,000 years. I should have thought. Perhaps it may have belonged to the garden of a long-vanished house, but whoever lived in that house must have been damnably wicked, I felt. I asked old Wyke about the place once, and he wasn't reassuring. When you wanted the cottage, I told you as you'd be happier down below in Bridge, he said. Don't say I didn't warn you. "What have you been hearing, lad? About something that flies in the night, I know. Them's all old wives' tales. But I won't say, but it's lonesome up there." I'd heard nothing about the place, and Wyke couldn't be persuaded to say another thing, but after he'd gone I thought over that phrase of his, about something that flew in the night. During the autumn gales I had often fancied I'd heard a sound like beating wings, a flapping below in the valley, as if some gigantic thing had gone to roost there. I had put it down to the wind playing tricks in the broken plantations at the foot of the valley. On one very gusty night the flapping had seemed to sound just outside the walls of the cottage, and I was woken from sleep by a slithering and tapping at the cottage door, and a scratching at the shutters. One late November day my work took me to a cavern on the northern ridge of the valley, a matter of testing how much strengthening would be needed there if the waters of the proposed reservoir reached a certain level. I'd taken a haversack lunch with me, but the job took longer than I'd thought, and the winter sun was flattening itself like a great red leech among the peaks beyond my distant cottage when I set off on my return journey. It was quickest to return by the valley, now I could not hope to make the cottage before nightfall. At first it was easy going. Soon I reached a bulldozer, its silhouette like an antediluvian monster's in the dusk. It marked the limit of the woodcutter's work for the day. One of the men, a little grey-haired chap called Whittaker from Sheffield, gave me good night. He'd evidently stayed behind to set rabbit snares, for wires were dangling from his pockets, and he stuffed something inside his jacket and was pretending to adjust the set of his red bandana neckerchief as I approached. I think I must have taken a wrong path in the steep plantation beyond, for by the time I reached the first of the ruined houses of Harrowvale, there was a bright frosty moon, which made indescribably horrible the gaping window sockets and the leprous tufted church tower. The brambles were particularly obstructive after I'd passed a church, and once or twice I fell headlong in the path. When I reached that open space, the crossroads, well, the Yew Tree wasn't there. I mean simply that, it just wasn't there. There was a great hole, like an open grave, ragged at the edges where it had stood, but not a sign of the tree. I told myself that the woodcutters must have uprooted it with the winch. Now there was no evidence of any such activity, only that great crumbling gap in the soil. It was a horrible tree, and I should have been glad it had gone, if only the hole it had left behind were not inexpressibly worse, a horror of horrors. I thought I saw something white at the bottom of the pit, and was just stepping forward to the brink when I heard again that monstrous flapping in the valley behind me, and it seemed a thin inhuman cry far off. I didn't stay to hear more, but set off almost at a run on the last breathless climb to my cottage. I made up a roaring fire and toasted cheese at it, and after supper read until 11. I don't think I concentrated much on my thriller. I was straining my ears into the silence for that monstrous sound of wings. Once or twice I thought I heard it, but it might have been a falling branch. I slept that night uneasily, and about 2 I was woken by a rattling and shaking of the cottage door. The wind, I thought, yet when I sat up in bed I realised it could not have been so. The night was quite still. There was a rustling flap like an enormous bird settling itself on its perch, the sound you hear when you pass a fowl house at night, but grotesquely magnified. I lit the lamp at my bedside and waited. There was the familiar slithering sound. It seemed this time to come from above me, from the roof. Then I heard a sliding in the chimney, and I saw something snake-like writhing in the grate, something yellowish moving across the floor to my bed. It stopped halfway, writhing frustratedly, trying to flatten itself a little further, trying to gain an extra inch. The thing was a tree root, a root with the earth still clinging to it. The whole room stank of the graveyard. For a moment the tip of the root quivered and writhed and beckoned, then it was slowly withdrawn and I heard it coiling itself back up the chimney. After that I just went out like a blown match. I'd have thought it a dream in the morning, but the lamp had burnt itself out at my bedside, and there were bits of earth in the grate and on the hearthrug. There was a hard frost outside, and there were strange marks in the silver as though snakes had drawn themselves over the turf. On my doorstep there was a scattering of scarlet berries, and a sprig, I'd almost said a feather, of yew. The sound of wood-cutting came from farther down the valley. I wanted human company desperately just then, so I set off the shortest way, and there was no gap at the crossroad place. The yew tree stood where it had always been, black and secretive and malignant. I found Wyke with a group of men round a bulldozer. He was in a growling range. "One of the fellows has cleared off Whittaker, the chap who's the best hand at the winching. You can't rely on these Sheffield chaps, just taken his hook and gone. But it's causing no end of trouble with the men here. They've been listening to stories too, want to knock off an hour early." I said I sympathised with them, and I suggested they should start the morning's work on the yew tree at the head of the valley. The men murmured among themselves, and "Yew Tree indeed," said Wyke. "Pack of old wives' tales." "Old wives' tales or not, Mr. Wyke," I said, "I'll bet you 10 guineas you wouldn't spend tonight in that cottage with me." Wyke loved guineas, but he hesitated and tried to bluff it out. "It's all stuff, and I won't have you upsetting my men with your tales, neither." But the men were on my side. "It's a fair wager, Mr. Wyke." 10 guineas, I said. "Take it or leave it. If you come, bring one of those axes with you. I'll borrow this one, if I may. We can start work on the yew tree tomorrow." When Wyke came to my cottage at about 4 in the afternoon, he brought the axe, and a clergyman with him. Mr. Veering, the rector of Baronsbridge, was a white-haired man with a thin, intelligent face and pleasant manners. "Rector's interested in these tales, so I've brought him too." Harrowvale used to be a part of the parish of All Souls, Baronsbridge, Mr. Keith. I have at home a journal kept by one of my predecessors, a Mr. Endor. He was rector here 40 years and died in 1810. Harrowvale was abandoned at the end of the 18th century, and Mr. Endor's account of what caused it, well, he was an old man, and it is charitable to suppose that his wits were beginning to wander. I told them what I had seen and heard during the night. Veering looked at me sharply once or twice, and Wyke muttered uneasily. "He's been listening to gossip's tales, rector, that's what it is." The last rector did, I believe, rather indiscreetly speak about the matters contained in Ender's journal. "The only gossip I've heard has come from Wyke," I said, "about something that flies in the night." Quite well, we shall see." We did. The thing came flapping about the cottage just after midnight. This time it tried out new tactics. It loosened a couple of tiles, and the roots came coiling down like snakes through the gap, and gripped Wyke by the ankle. He yelled fearfully while Veering and I slashed at the tentacles that held him with our axes. They were horribly tough, and when we had cut through them, the severed tendrils writhed like worms on the floor. The weight on the roof shifted, and we heard it flapping off dismally into the valley. "It'll come back again," Wyke cried hoarsely. "It'll come back and widen that hole." "The thing keeps to the valley," said the rector. "Endor said it kept to the valley. It came like this, and people disappeared from their homes." "It'll come again," Wyke wailed. "Once it's found a way in, it'll come again." "We would get to the top of the ridge," I said, "and over it to Baronsbridge. It'll swoop on us before ever we can get to the top. We're done for." "I don't relish the idea of waiting for it to come back," said Veering. "Outside the valley we are in God's hands. Here we can pray at least." and then make a dash for it, I said. The valley was quite silent. We knelt, keeping as far as possible from those still writhing root tips on the floor, while Mr. Veering prayed that we might be delivered from the powers of darkness. Then we let ourselves out of the back door and scrambled up the hill. The thing scented us and came hawking after us. We heard it flapping behind us, and sometimes glimpsed a shape like a huge bird, with ropes instead of talons circling over the treetops, or sprawling ungainly on the valley slope. We kept as best we could to cover, but the trees thinned out as we neared the summit of the ridge, and in our last wild scramble to the top it sighted us. I heard a whistling noise as it swooped, and a cry from Veering. He had tripped and fallen, and behind him I could make out a great dim mass, slithering and moving over the turn. At first I thought him lost. The thing had only to pounce again, and then I understood. It could fly no higher. It was caged in its evil valley. It had come to roost below the ridge, and was sending up those long yellow tentacles of roots to take its prey. "Get up!" I shouted. "For God's sake, Veering, a few more steps and you're safe!" Already a thin loop had coiled round one foot, and thicker coils wriggled obscenely towards him over the grass. "Use your axe, parson!" cried Wyke. "Your axe!" Veering heard us. There was a thud and angry whistling, and the next moment we had pulled him to safety beside us. For a while we lay all three exhausted on the ridge path, listening to the slithering of those roots as they sought blindly the victim that had escaped them. Then we turned our backs on Harrowvale and took the steep path down the other side to Baronsbridge. When we reached the rectory, Mr. Veering handed me a quarto volume bound in green morocco leather, and I sat up all the night reading old Endor's spidery script in the faded sepia ink, while Wyke huddled in a seat by the fire with a Bible on his knees. The trouble, according to Endor's account, had begun when the yew tree bore its first berries. There was a legend current in his day that in the early 17th century a woman from Harrowvale was hanged for witchcraft, and was buried at the crossroads with a stake, a yew stake, through her heart. On the scaffold she vowed that she would come back, flying in the night, and exterminate the village. The last words she spoke before the hangman pulled the noose were, "When the first drop of blood shall be sprinkled on his feathers, the owl will go a-mousing." In the morning we brought several cans of petrol and a stick or two of gelignite to that yew tree above the ruined village of Harrowvale, and we blew the accursed thing up. It screamed as it fell. There were things tangled among its roots, skulls and bones, a rusted sword, an old flintlock pistol and a gold chain, some rabbit snares too, and a red bandana handkerchief, quite unrotted. But the most awful thing was a great pink slug, cocooned in grey hair, a palpitating, bloated thing that suggested a woman, hideously swollen with a dropsy. We poured petrol among the roots and into that vile pit and set fire to it. The fire burnt all day, and not much remained of the tree or the thing in its roots. When I last looked down into Harrowvale, it was a great tarnished-looking glass of water. All the same, when the firm offered me a job boring for water in the great dust bowl of Australia, I jumped at it. You can travel for miles, they tell me, without seeing a single tree.